Hello, welcome to day 256. This is the sixth day of the 51st week, and that's December 22. Very close to Happy Christmas. You know, we thank God for coming this far in the year and for His mercies that has kept us and preserved us. So today we're going to be praying into the sixth day of the week, and the sixth day is a time to remember that God made man on the sixth day. Human relationships, humans and human relationships, everything that has to do with man began on the sixth day of creation. That's when man began, that's when woman began, that's when, you know, that's when everything about, you know, work relationship among humans, that's when it started. The sixth day is a time to remember that. And but it's also good to remember that the sixth day is not just about humans. Before God made human beings, He first made other creatures. In Genesis chapter 1, verse 24, He said, "Let the earth bring forth the living creature." And then, we read about how God made the cattle, how God made the creeping things, and how He made the birds of the air. And then in verse 26, He said, "Let us make man in our image and after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves on the earth." So God made these other creatures before making man. Now, when we come to apply truth to ourselves, to understand, what the sixth is about, we're no longer talking about, cattle and creeping things and the beast. We're now looking at what does this mean to us? How can we apply this? What does this teach us? This is not it's not just a day to remember fish and remember the cattle and remember the beasts of the field. It's a day to understand what God did on the sixth day of creation. And the key to understanding this is to know that what God did on the sixth day of creation is illustrated in the sixth book of the Bible and illustrated in the six chapters of the Bible. Don't forget that. What God did on any day of creation is illustrated in the book and chapters of the Bible that correspond to that day of creation. So if you really want to see the application of what God did on the sixth day of creation, you look at the sixth book of the Bible, where God gave dominion to Israel and to occupy the land of the Canaanites. So it was like setting. It was like it becomes a season of conflict between the godly and the ungodly. Look, so you can think of any sixth season book, any sixth book of the Bible, or any six chapters of the Bible. In Second Kings chapter 6, it was between Elisha and the Syrians that came to arrest him. In Esther chapter 6, it was between Mordecai and Haman that was coming to get permission to hang him. In Daniel chapter 6, it was between Daniel and the others who wanted him dead. And now the lions. If you go to Nehemiah chapter 6, it's between Nehemiah and Sanballat and Tobiah and all the opposition. So the sixth season is about the godly and the ungodly and how that God has given authority and dominion to the godly. So the sixth day is a time to remember that God has given dominion to the godly, and of course, shows the godly how to live their lives. So it's a day to learn what God, how does God want the godly to live their lives. So that's what we're going to be looking at as we turn to the sixth prophetic division of the book of Colossians. Colossians is the 51st book of the Bible. So we're going to go to the sixth prophetic division of this and see, how, what is the Lord saying to the godly on this day. Now we go to verse 18. He said, wives, submit to your own husbands. Remember that husband and wife relationship started on the sixth day. So, wives, submit to your own husbands as is fitting to the Lord. Husbands, love your wives and do not be bitter toward them. He made them male and female. That's what Genesis 1:27 tells us. He made them male and female. And then 28, he said, God blessed them, saying, be fruitful, multiply. He said, children, obey your parents in the Lord in all things, for this is well pleasing in the Lord. Fathers, do not provoke your children, lest they become discouraged. So, this is so appropriate to talk about this because family began on the sixth day, and the Lord is now showing how we ought to relate, how the godly ought to relate to the family. Wives, submit to your own husbands. Husbands, love your wives. And then, children, obey your parents in all things. Obey, obey. And then, parents, do not provoke your children, so that they do not become discouraged. And then it goes to work relationships. It goes to work relationship. Bond servants, obey in all things your masters according to the flesh, not with eye service as men pleasers, but in sincerity of heart, fearing God. It is because of what God did, the creation of man on the sixth day, that we can even have masters and bond servants. There wouldn't have been any master servant relationship. And it says in verse 23, and whatever you do, do it heartily as to the Lord and not unto men. This is the instruction to the godly. So it's not just enough to know that God made man in his image. God also prescribed a way of life for the godly. And that's what we're reading about. We have to follow that. Remember that it was on the sixth day of creation, after God created man, he said to him, behold, I have given to you this. So God, the first time God communed with a creature was on the sixth day. So it's a season when we need to listen to God and hear the heart of God. He say, and whatever you do, do it heartily as to the Lord and not to men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the reward of the inheritance, for you serve the Lord Christ, but he who does wrong will be repaid for what he has done, and there is no partiality. There is no partiality. No partiality. Now, we move on to the first 6 verses in chapter 4. Masters, give your bondservants what is just and fair, knowing that you also have a master in heaven. So this is to show how the godly ought to live. First in the family, and then in the workspace. How we live in the family counts, and then we come to the workspace. This is where godliness must manifest. Godliness at home, godliness at work. So this is about how we ought to work. Now, in verse 2, he said, continue earnestly in prayer, being vigilant in it with thanksgiving. Meanwhile, praying also for us that God will open for us a door for the word to speak the mystery of Christ, for which I am also in chains, that I may make it manifest as I ought to speak. Walk in wisdom toward those who are outside, redeeming the time. Let your speech always be with grace, seasoned with salt, that you may know how you ought to answer each one. So, from Colossians chapter 3, verse 18 to chapter 4, verse 6, shows us this is how the godly ought to live. In the family, husband and wife, parents to children, children to parents, this is how you ought to live. Workspace, you go to the workplace, master, servants, this is how to treat your masters. This is how to work. Whatever work you do, do it as to the Lord, because you represent Jesus Christ in your place of work. There is no such thing as secular work for a child of God, because wherever you are an ambassador of Jesus Christ. You ought to represent Jesus Christ where you are. Your work is blessed because you are doing the work in the name of the Lord. Yesterday, we were talking about uh, we read Colossians chapter 3, verse 17, where it says, whatever you do in word or deed, do all in the name of the Lord. So when you work, do your work in the name of the Lord. Do it as if Christ himself is the one doing it, because you walk in the Christ company. You are an ambassador of Jesus Christ. So wherever you find yourself, walk and live there as an ambassador, as one representing Jesus Christ. So, godliness is not about when we come to church. It's about wherever we are, we manifest godliness. And then it takes us to the church. It said, continue earnestly in prayer. This is, what the godly ought to do. The church is a place of prayer. House of God is a place of prayer. Continue being vigilant with thanksgiving, meanwhile praying for us that the word, that God would open to us a door for the word to speak it, to speak the mystery of Christ, for which I am also in chains, that I may make it manifest as I ought to speak. So that's it. And now in the word. So in the family, in the workplace, in the church, and in the word. This passage prescribes how the godly ought to live. It said in verse 5, it said, walk in wisdom toward those who are outside, redeeming the time, lest your speech always. So redeeming the time. Redeeming the time. This is the way that I understand this. When God made time, he gave each time its purpose. First day, let there be light. Second day, let there be second day, let there be the firmament. And then each day had something that God did. And time did not rebel against God. Time did not rebel against God. But with the fall of man, it became possible to use time that God created for his purpose for other purposes. So that's why time needs redemption. Time is enslaved. The enemy can hijack time for his own purposes. When God made time, time only served God's purpose. But now, because of the fall, the enemy can take a hold of time and do his own thing. So now the Bible calls us to redeem the time, walk in wisdom, walk in the wisdom of God, and use each time for his purpose. That's what we do. That's why I share these things, that each time has a purpose, and you need to understand the purpose of each time and use time for its purpose. So redeem the time. Redeem the time, So walk in wisdom toward those who are without, redeeming the time, reclaiming the time for its purpose. Let every purpose has its time, and every time has its purpose. Let each time be used for its purpose. So when you speak, speak with grace, seasoned with salt, that you may know how you ought to answer each one. So I pray in the name of Jesus that you will capture the will of God for this day, that this is a day for the godly to take their place and live the life that they ought to live, where they are, in the family, in the place of work, in the church, and in the world. I bless you in the name of the Lord, that the sixth day of the week will go well for you. In Jesus' name.